say?
I think that my job has become more focused since I first started working here. When I first began, I had 2 full-time assistants and the services of graduate student who worked 20 hours a week. And there were more responsibilities. For example, the museum shop was part of the responsibility because we had an unsophisticated phone system. Everybody took phone calls and everybody took messages for everybody else, and everybody knew what was going on everywhere. When Historic Columbia took over the management of the houses, the 2 full-time assistants I had were phased out, and the collections manager became the assistant director of education. After about a year or so, Ray Sigmund, then the director of Historic Columbia Foundation, decided to give more importance to the aspects of her job which involved scheduling tours, scheduling docents, and taking care of the museum shop. So he made her into a department head of her own with responsibility for the scheduling of tours, the scheduling of docents, and the running of the museum shop. That meant that I was able to concentrate more on the interpretation of the houses and the public programming that we did.
Who do you work with right now? Who would you consider working with you directly on your staff?
Right now I have a graduate student, Jeff Durst. He's actually a graduate assistant. This is his 2nd year, and he will probably continue again next year. And he's a tremendous help. He ran the Woodrow Wilson Open House after the Veterans Day Parade last year, and he's doing the same again, but expanding the program this year. He also upgraded the exhibit at the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home, and he's continuing to upgrade it this year. He wrote the material on the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home for the docent manual, the newly revised material that I've been working on and John's worked on as well, John Shearer. I also have been working with Nicole Holland. She was the part-time coordinator of African American programming who was hired a year ago in the spring and resigned her position about a year later. She is continuing to work with Historic Columbia Foundation as a consultant in African American and multicultural education. She bore most of the responsibility for Jubilee last year, and she helped considerably as the coordinator for Jubilee this year. But because she was no longer a full-time employee, a lot of the responsibility for Jubilee fell back on my plate this year.
What type of interactions do you have with people outside of Historic Columbia?
For example,
do you work with principals, or do you work with, in your role in education, do you work with schools and helping develop programs, or do you work with the city council, or anybody outside of Historic Columbia?
Well, let me start out with professional involvement. I belong to a group called Amaze. It's a group of educators who work at the zoo, other museums, the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the university. We get together quarterly to discuss the programming that is going on at each institution and to discuss problems or issues that may concern all of us. For example, one year many organizations were having problems with homeschool groups, and we got together to try to discuss ways that we could deal with the issues that these groups presented. I also belong to an organization called TAPS. This is an organization run by the Metropolitan Columbia Convention and Visitors Bureau. The initials stand for Tourism Area Professionals. And these the members of TAPS are representatives of not only the museums, the zoo, but also other organizations in town that appeal to tourists, like the State House, the Columbia baseball team, the Gem and Mineral Society, the Lake Murray Tourism Organization. This group meets every other month at a particular organization. Again, we discuss what's going on with our organization at the moment, and sometimes we'll tour the organization or have some kind of program. I work closely with the docents here to ensure that they are up to the minute on the new interpretations at the houses. We use the docents heavily in the public programming. For example, at Jubilee, our docents gave tours of the Man Simon's Cottage, and I had trained several docents on the new African American Heritage Sites tour. And we rented trolleys from the city, and the docents hopped on the trolleys with tourists and gave the tour, which is a tour around the city of Columbia, which touches on about 25 or so historic sites important to the community and particularly to the African American community. We have not worked particularly with schools in the past, although we have worked with particular teachers. The Richland 2 Alert program in particular has brought students over a number of years to Historic Columbia to do architectural tours, focusing on the architecture of the houses and also the architecture of Main Street. In the spring of this year, Historic Columbia Foundation hired a new executive director and CEO, T. Patrick Brennan, who came from Norfolk, Virginia. He was working with the Jamestown 2007 commemoration. Before that, he was at the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, with responsibility for the educational programs at the historic house museums there. He is very keenly interested in curriculum-based school tours, and as a result, we will be working with curriculum coordinators at Richland 1 and Richland 2, the closest school districts, to see how our historic house museums and the programs that we offer can be of value to teachers at those schools. South Carolina has recently instituted curriculum standards in all areas, and currently there is a great emphasis on teaching language arts, reading, and math, and keeping children in the classrooms so that they can prepare themselves for the PACT, P-A-C-T testing that will occur in the spring. I understand that social studies, which is the principal aspect of the curriculum that Historic Columbia can address, is taking a back seat to the other subjects. So I intend to meet with curriculum coordinators to see how we can redesign our programs to address the needs that teachers have. Raise the question again?
Certainly. What are the major difficulties in your job that you've had to overcome in the past 6 years?
I think the major difficulty that I've been faced with is the instability of the organization. Approximately 2 years after Beth Herron was hired, at the same time that I was hired, she left her position as the Director of Visitor and Volunteer Services. A new Director of Visitor and Volunteer Services was hired, and she stayed here for approximately 1 year. At the time she left, another employee was dismissed in the Public Relations Department. The board felt that it needed to fill that position, the public relations position, before the Director of Visitor and Volunteer Services. At the time, I had a graduate student, a graduate assistant, whom I asked to fill briefly the position of Director of Visitor and Volunteer Services. Well, the Personnel Committee hired a Public Relations Coordinator, and then it hired a Director of Marketing. And it wasn't until very much later in the following spring that a Director of Visitor and Volunteer Services was hired. That meant that I was without the assistance of my graduate assistant for almost an entire year. The job proved a great strain to her because she was a full-time student, and there was a lot of it was a very difficult time. Then about the same time, the executive director resigned from his position, and we had an interim director for approximately a year. And then the interim director was followed by an acting director who had the position for, again, approximately a year. And I think the instability in the Education and Visitor and Volunteer Services Department, coupled with two interim directors, made my position very difficult.
Can you give me some examples of where the difficulties occurred?
Well, each of the interim directors did an outstanding job, but because they were dealing with day-to-day, really on-the-job issues, the organization didn't have a strategic plan in place, and there was really no vision on the part of the acting directors in terms of very long-term goals. And so I think that presented great difficulties. The first of the acting directors was extremely successful in getting funding from city and county governments to levels that had never been achieved before. And getting the city and county governments to commit to capital improvements at the properties, improvements that the second of the acting directors was able to secure and implement. And I think that both of these women made incredible improvements to the properties themselves, to the historic houses, to the improvement of the condition of the houses in terms of major renovations, dramatic improvements in the operating equipment, the HVAC systems, and also interior and exterior painting and renovation. Particularly true at the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home 2 years ago, true at the Hampton-Preston Mansion last year, and now ongoing at the Robert Mills House and the Man Simons Cottage. Arrington Cox and Cindy Neesmith deserve the credit for those major improvements.
Do you think the instabilities radiated all the way down to the docents? For example, do you think the docents were able to tell that there was instability at the top? As in, do you think the change of leadership, the churn of leadership, do you think it affected all the way down to the docents?
Oh, most definitely. They were quite aware of the lack of stability over here in the West Flanker. And from time to time, docents would come in, volunteer their services for extra help. man the telephones, take on jobs that they ordinarily would not have taken on, just so that they could lighten the load on the staff over here.
So you found them, you found that the docents mostly pitched in the time of need.
Yes, the docents here are unfailingly loyal, and they have been, many of the longtime docents have been through many changes in the organization, and they are devoted to the historic houses, and they're willing to do what they can to assist the staff.
How has the change of interpretation that has occurred since the 1969? How has that affected the docents that are long term, that are here for almost having to sometimes relearn about the house again that they've been in for many years?
Well, I think in some cases docents have been able to do that, but frankly in other cases docents have not been able to do that. I have a dramatic example of this in that several years ago, just before I arrived here, the educational assistant with responsibility for the Hampton-Preston mansion was writing a thesis at USC in the Applied History program on the women of the Hampton-Preston mansion. And in conjunction with her thesis, she did an exhibit on women at the Hampton-Preston mansion and did an interpretation, a slideshow and an interpretation which focused on the women rather than the men. At the time, the interpretation at the Hampton-Preston mansion focused on the three Wade Hamptons, even though only the first Wade Hampton actually lived in the house. Well, there were some long-term docents who simply could not deviate from the three Wades, could not talk about the women as the focus of the tour during Women's History Month in 1994. Because the exhibit was partially funded by a grant from the South Carolina Humanities Council, certain paperwork had to be done to accompany the final report that was submitted. Surveys were taken of some of the visitors to the house which asked how well the docent interpreted the women at the house. And one particular docent was simply unable to interpret the women. And this information came through on a survey that some of the visitors completed. So there are docents who are unable to make the transition, but there are other docents who have embraced the more inclusive picture that we are giving them at the houses. And the Hampton-Preston mansion is a good example of that, because the interpretation now focuses on the people who lived there. That is, the first people who owned the house, Ainsley and Sarah Hall, who sold it subsequently to Wade Hampton I for his wife, Mary Canty Hampton, their daughter, Caroline Hampton-Preston, and her husband, John Smith Preston, who lived there intermittently from 1835 on, after Wade Hampton's death. And then the woman who saved the house from burning when Sherman's forces occupied Columbia, Sister Baptista Lynch, the Ursuline Mother Superior, whose convent was burned by Sherman's troop, despite his assurances to her beforehand that no private property would be destroyed. And then the College for Women and Chicora College, who occupied the property from 1890 through 1930. Euphemia McClintock was one of the first women heads of the College for Women, and she was a very strong woman who instituted a curriculum which prepared women for medical school and law school. She actually wanted the college to merge with USC, but her board of trustees turned her request down, and she subsequently resigned.
How do you communicate these changes in interpretation, or the breadth of interpretation that we see in Hampton-Preston, for example? How do you communicate that with docents?
That's communicated in the material that's developed for the docent handbook. For example, John wrote the material on the Hampton-Preston mansion based on his thesis, which was a comprehensive history of the Hampton-Preston mansion. I did the new interpretation for the Robert Mills house, and to do that I did a considerable amount of research on Robert Mills, the training that he had in architecture, the buildings that he designed in not only South Carolina but throughout the eastern seaboard and in Washington, D.C. in particular. I also did a great deal of research on the Columbia Theological Seminary, which was established in the Robert Mills house after the death of Ainsley Hall. I did also a considerable amount of research on Ainsley Hall, his business, his marriage to Sarah Goodwin Hall, and the lawsuits that occurred as a result of his death. That material was made available to the docents early in the spring of this year. My next project was a reworking of the Main Street tour. Historic Columbia Foundation offers a tour of historic Main Street. Most of the buildings on Main Street were burned in 1865 when Sherman's troops occupied Columbia. So most of the historic buildings on Main Street date from the late 60s and on through the early part of the 20th century. I did a considerable amount of research on most of the buildings that are considered historic buildings on the National Register of Historic Places, and put together what was really a 75-page document on the buildings on Main Street. My graduate assistant, Jeff Durst, did a study of the Woodrow Wilson House in the spring of this year to present new material to the docents. Both he and my prior graduate assistant, Alana Laskowski, in her first year as my graduate assistant, before she was borrowed by visitor and volunteer services, worked on Woodrow Wilson's enduring ties to Columbia, and that was a subject on which Alana did a paper, and she incorporated some of that material into the exhibit at Woodrow Wilson. Jeff Durst has decided to revise the exhibit to incorporate more of that material. Wilson came back to Columbia several times after his family left here in 1874. Particularly, he stopped here in 1885 before his marriage to Ellen Axon in Georgia. And then his older sister, Annie Howe, married George Howe Jr., who was the son of George Howe, a professor of theology at the seminary, and she lived here all of her life. When Wilson came here in 1885, he stayed briefly with Annie and George Howe before his marriage, and then he came back here and spent part of his honeymoon here. And then he was here in 1911 for the laying of the cornerstone at the library. The YWCA. It was constructed on land donated to the Y by his aunt, Mrs. Woodrow. The building subsequently became the Richland County Public Library. He was back here also in 1916 for the funeral of his sister Annie Josephine Howe. Annie Josephine and their parents, Jesse Woodrow Wilson and Joseph Ruggles Wilson, are buried in the churchyard at First Presbyterian Church here.
How has the recent, or has it at all, the recent suits around who has control over the properties, Historic Columbia or the other organization, how have these affected education at all, or docents at all, or is there, or if it does have an effect, what is it?
I took my job in June of 1994, knowing that the Richland County Historic Preservation Commission had transferred title or intended to transfer title to the properties to the City of Columbia and to Richland County. And I knew that I might well, after 6 months, be out of a job. I was very fortunate in that when Historic Columbia Foundation received the contract to manage the properties, Ray Sigmund, then the executive director, invited all of the employees of the commission to apply for their jobs with the foundation. And I was fortunate that he hired me as the director of education. But I think that the lawsuit that was subsequently filed created a black cloud over the organization, Historic Columbia Foundation, and I think it adversely affected the morale of all of the employees as well as the docents. When the first suit was resolved by the Supreme Court, indicating that the woman who brought the suit, Mrs. Ida Quincy Newman, who had been a member of the Richland County Historic Preservation Commission, had no standing to bring the suit, it was clearly evident that the cloud was dispelled. But then when Jenny Dreer, Evans, Hazelhurst brought a second suit, the cloud descended again. I think that at that time, the morale of the organization was considerably better because the expectation was that probably the suit would resolve in the same conclusion. Unfortunately, it was not. And I think that for a brief time this spring, there was a great deal of consternation, particularly since Patrick Brennan had just joined the organization. But the commission and the foundation were able to work out an agreement by which the foundation still manages the houses, and the foundation is funded by the city and the county.
Off the interview, do you have anything that you want to say to somebody who might be interested 20 years from now in the running of your job? This is be a free answer time.
Actually, I'd rather forestall that question, because when we were talking about how the interpretation has changed at the houses, I didn't get on to the Man Simons Cottage, and that's a really important property here. The Man Simons Cottage is one of the two most important sites in the state. It's one of only two sites in the state owned by free blacks and preserved as historic house museums. This house was owned by Celia Mann in antebellum Columbia. Previously, we thought that she probably came to Columbia maybe in the 1850s. Oral tradition in her family held that she was a midwife and that she walked to Columbia as early as the 1830s. Her daughter Agnes Jackson being born in the cottage in 1831. In 1995, Beth Herron and I were doing some research for an exhibit at the cottage on the family and the cottage and the transformation of the cottage from a family home to a historic house museum. And we discovered Celia Mann's obituary, published in 1867. She was described as an old and respected colored nurse who was present at the birth of many of our citizens. And that information, that documentation, corroborated the family's tradition that she was a midwife. I mentioned earlier that family tradition held that she came to Columbia in the early 30s and that Agnes Jackson was born in the house in 1831. We haven't yet corroborated that, but we have pushed back Celia Mann's time at the property to 1844 through a land record discovered on the equity rolls. So we can document her being at the house in 1844. And if we can push that back a little further through some other documentation, we might be able to corroborate the family's oral tradition. Another thing that we have recently done with respect to the Mann-Simons cottage is an archaeological excavation in the spring of 1998. A 4 square foot teaching gardens had been installed there in the late 1980s by the Wisteria Garden Club, a group of women who support the cottage. Square foot teaching gardens in the late 1990s fell into disuse. They actually were not used as teaching gardens in 1994 when I first started working here. And the members of the Wisteria Garden Club wanted to install a better landscape at the garden to reflect the rich diversity of African American gardeners. So we wrote a grant seeking the design services of a landscape architect. The grant was successful. We had a landscape architect draw up a master plan in conjunction with suggestions made by members of the Wisteria Garden Club, and then began moving plants from the square foot teaching gardens to temporary gardens. Well, when we tried to dig the temporary gardens, we ran into the brick footings of a house owned by one of the members of the Simons family, and we also began discovering artifacts, pieces of ceramic, glassware, and metal objects. I talked to Dr. Jonathan Leda, the State Deputy Director of the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at the university, and he advised us to seek funding for an archaeological excavation. Subsequently, the South Carolina Humanities Council and the United Black Fund funded an excavation, and we literally hit pay dirt. We found 2 densely packed 19th century trash pits at the far corner of the property by the pecan tree. Overall, the archaeologists excavated more than 8,000 objects, but in these 2 densely packed trash pits, we found all kinds of things. The most significant being a centennial pin with the dates 1776, 1876, and an image of Fort McHenry with the Star-Spangled Banner flying. That gives us a date for the trash pits. They can't be any earlier than 1876. And we associate the trash pits with the enlargement of the cottage that took place around 1880. But some of the objects in the trash pits, because of their size, the ceramic pieces, there were sort of 2 sets of ceramic pieces unearthed. Some of them were very large pieces that we were able to reconstruct into a saucer and a plate and a mason jar. Other pieces were quite small and obviously later, dating from the 1830s, say, and the archaeologist thinks that some of these pieces date from the time of Celia Mann, were deposited at one time and then were walked upon so that they broke down into smaller pieces and then were redeposited. So we are confident that we have uncovered some artifacts used in the daily life of Celia Mann herself, and we are going to be doing an exhibition on the excavation, probably to open in the spring. And this exhibition will give us more information about the daily lives of Celia Mann, Agnes Jackson, and the Simons family in the middle and the
I
late
think,
19th century.
The thing that we have missed in this interview is how much fun my job is. It's a very interesting and varied job. I never do the same thing every day. There are so many exciting opportunities here. I do research, I do writing, I create information to share with other people. I deal directly with the docents. I deal also with the general public, whether it's school children or tourists. Just yesterday, I took a group of fifth graders from a local elementary school on an architectural tour of Main Street. We stopped at the Arcade Mall and we did a rubbing of the carved tiles there. We trooped through South Trust Bank in the Palmetto building to see the Palmetto mosaic on the floor and to look at the bronze doorknobs with Palmetto motifs on them. We stopped in Sylvan's jewelry store to look at the architecture inside and to see the basket that goes from the balcony to the first floor to transport jewelry up to the jeweler on the balcony. And we walked through Rising High to look at the Egyptian columns in the adaptively reused Crest building. At Christmas time, when we have our Christmas programs, I go into the carriage house and I wax fruit. We do greenery workshops and I show people how to make wreaths or kissing balls. At Jubilee, I greet the artists with whom I've developed a relationship over the past several years. The quilter Geneva Lowe, who does a fabulous cathedral windows quilt. The basket makers, Vera Manigo and Leola Wright. Leola did a program for me several years ago on sweetgrass baskets. We had Dale Rosengarten, a scholar, do a slide presentation on the African origins of sweetgrass baskets. And then we had the author, Margie Willis Clary, read from her book, A Sweet, Sweet Basket, and then Leola Wright demonstrated the weaving of the sweetgrass baskets. At Jubilee, I also see Sam Davis, city councilman and blacksmith, who's now become my good friend, and Philip Simmons, the blacksmith from Charleston. It's always a great thrill to me to have Jubilee because Philip Simmons comes looking to say hello to me, and that is a priceless treasure. It's really fun to see the Woodrow Wilson open house when our junior docents are dressed in Victorian costumes and out on the lawn showing visitors how to roll hoops or play croquet. It's very satisfying to share my information about Woodrow Wilson with other people. Several years ago, the Post Office put out the Century of Stamps series, and for the series for the decade of the 1910s, they issued one stamp in honor of Woodrow Wilson. The first day of issue was to be at the Woodrow Wilson birthplace in Stanton, Virginia, and the Post Office wanted to get together representatives from all of the Wilson sites. So I was invited to attend the first day of issue and give a presentation on Woodrow Wilson and his ties to Columbia. It was very exciting to be with the director of the birthplace, the director of the Wilson Museum in Washington, D.C., and the director of the museum from Historic Augusta. So these are some of the things that make my job so interesting, and I think that's something that hadn't been expressed in any other aspect of this interview.
Would you like me to restate? Have you seen, do you want to say anything else about how your job has, about how your job is done, or about how your job, the relationship with your job and other jobs, or any changes that you've seen?
One major change I've seen is a dramatic increase in the number of African American docents we have. Part of it, I think, is due to the establishment of the position of coordinator of African American programming, and we have more material now for African American docents. One of my first experiences here in 1994 was giving a tour of the Mann Simons Cottage twice one Sunday afternoon to two family reunion groups. The first group applauded me. The second group wanted to know what other African American sites there were to visit. And as I said earlier, I'm not from Columbia, so I wasn't very familiar with historic sites in the city, having just started my job. This was literally week one. And then I remembered that Alan and Benedict were just up the road, and I said, "Oh, Alan and Benedict." And the women on the tour just laughed at me because they had graduated from there, or their parents had graduated from there, and they were quite familiar with both campuses. So the next day I told one of my education assistants, who happened to be African American, that we needed to develop a tour. There was a need for a tour. So we began working on that tour, and last year, finally, I was able to write a proposal to PRT, South Carolina's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, to secure funding for the publication of a slick and glitzy brochure on African American heritage sites in Columbia. Then Nicole came on board, and the two of us worked on the brochure and the tour together. And finally, in time for last Jubilee, we were able, no, not last Jubilee, we were able to preview the tour last Jubilee in 1999 on the city's trolleys, and in February or March of this year, we actually had the brochure in hand, and we had a kickoff party down at Benedict College. So that we now have in 2000 a brochure that I first saw a need for in 1994 is a dramatic change, and gives me a great sense of accomplishment. I think another change I've seen is a dramatic change in the attitude of the City of Columbia and Richland County towards these properties. When I first started working, they funded the properties at very low levels, but now they have increased their funding, both the daily operational funding and the funding for capital improvements. The City of Columbia installed a state-of-the-art HVAC system, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system in the Robert Mills House last year. It took them practically a year to complete the installation. But now the Mills House has a state-of-the-art system which will last maybe another 30 years. That was how long the first one lasted. In like measure, the city has improved the Mann Simons Cottage, both on the interior and on the exterior. The county has made dramatic improvements to the Hampton-Preston mansion, installing a new HVAC system there, and making other improvements, the restoration of the windows. And the year before, the county made a big commitment to the Woodrow Wilson House. So these changes bode well for the Historic House Museums and also for Historic Columbia Foundation, which is managing them.